Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing great wherever you may be. It's great to be back with you here online. I am coming to you from a rainy day in Columbus, Ohio. It is, there's beautiful days even with rain. Today was one of those that was kind of light and stormy and kind of didn't keep you from doing anything, but still kind of was just still kind of a dreary day. But I know that tomorrow will be a beautiful day. It'll be a wonderful day, and there will be flowers out and the rest. It's really starting to hit springtime here, even though we had snow last week. So in Ohio, that the weather changes fairly quickly. So I don't have all my comments up currently and all those things, so I can't see all the normal stuff that I normally see. But I'm grateful for your presence, for you being here with us and the rest. So grateful for wherever you're tuning in from. Whether it's from Georgia or Tennessee or California or from China. We have students and people coming in from all over the world these days, or tuning in from Italy, wherever you might be. Just grateful for your presence, for being with us throughout this quarter. We are coming up at the end. In fact, we are at the letters 27, 28, 29, and the next week is 30 and 31. And then we've got a little bit of the prologue at the end that we'll deal with. So we've got 2 more weeks after tonight. Before we wrap up this study of the Screwtape Letters, which has been a fantastic one. I really enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it too. It's been truly a pleasure to study through all these things, to walk through them, to see all the different things that can be gleaned, can be learned from this study. And I hope it's been a pleasure for you as much as it has been for me to go through this. I am looking forward to it. I've already begun work on the fall, what we're going to be going through in the fall. But besides that, I actually do have some, I guess I would call it good news for me at least. But I do plan on continuing this through the summer, starting in May. A different series. It's not actually on a book. It is actually through something that I will share at a different time. But very excited about it. And the invitation stands. It will actually be live just on my Facebook public. So not necessarily in the Rabbit Hole group, but will be live public for anybody to watch wherever you might want to be on Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Still live, 7 p.m. Eastern. So if you're in a different time zone, just remember that. And so I'm very excited about it. I'll kind of be launching that out in the next week or two to let people know what it is and what I plan on studying through. Obviously, it's going to be theological in nature. It's going to be spiritual in nature. It just won't require you to buy a book this time as I go through the summer. And then in the fall, we'll kick back in again with a new book, a new study to walk through together. It's my hope that you'll join us again at that point in time. If you're not live with us, it's wonderful still. Love all the views that are tuning in at a later date, a later time. I'm always amazed at how many people tune in. It shocks me each and every week, but I'm just grateful for your presence. So without saying anything else, basically off of that, let's dive in. We've got some fantastic letters to get through tonight, and I really want to dive into all of them. So, letter 27. My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. The use of his love to distract his mind from the enemy is of course obvious, but you reveal what poor use you are making of it when you say that the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become one of the chief subjects of his prayers. That means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and to try to continue the normal prayer as if nothing had happened. Once he accepts that distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy and makes it the main theme of his prayers and his endeavors, then so far from doing good, you have done harm. So he's getting at the very premise of prayers and what it means, including the distractions. And so the very notion of praying for the one he loves here, or being distracted by his feeling and then talking to God about it, the very premise of talking to the enemy and laying before him, making it his main theme, the Screwtape here is making the argument that that's not a good thing because it ultimately can lead to positive attritions, positive things that come about from it. Anything, even a sin, which has the total effect of making him close up to the enemy, moving him close up to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. So here he's getting, even though you might be trying to tempt him into lust or distracting his mind as he's praying about the beautiful woman that he's fallen in love with, or all these different things, even things that they would classify as sinful, if ultimately he's taking it before God, God can use those things in spite of what we often attempt, and it can be, as they're noting, makes against us in the long run. A promising line is the following. Now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen in his mind, and hence a new urgency in his purely petitionary prayers about this war and other such matters. Now is the time for raising intellectual difficulties about prayers of that sort. False spirituality is always to be encouraged. And so notice he's kind of getting at this. Now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen. So basically, this idea of he's in love, so he's family, so he's thinking about his future and his life with his bride and all of those different things and the future children and the rest. And so instead, you need to raise some of the intellectual difficulties about prayer of that sort, well, about the war and other such things, and so make them to be like where it create anxieties, create issues within his mind about such things, which then will create in their mind false spirituality should be encouraged. On the seemingly pious ground that praise and communion with God is the true prayer, humans can often be lured into direct disobedience to the enemy, who, in his usual flat, commonplace, uninteresting way, has definitely told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of the sick. In fact, we have a whole prayer about that, right? We often refer to it as the Lord's Prayer. You will, of course, conceal from him the fact that the prayer for daily bread, interpreted in a spiritual sense, is really just as crudely petitionary as it is in any other sense. So here's where he's getting, if they just go through the motions of saying the prayer, that ultimately just becomes spiritual jargon if they don't actually mean what they're saying, if they don't actually have a deep understanding of what it is that they're talking about. But since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget to use the heads I win, tails you lose argument. He's going to get into that here in a second. But specifically the concept of, and I think he got into this a couple letters ago, this idea of just going through the motions of finding that there's not a whole lot going on. And I use this every once in a while when I talk to people. I ask the question, do you believe in the power of prayer? Do you believe that prayer can change people? In the same light, I always ask people, do you believe in miracles? And it's fascinating the response on that, because some will say, well, I believe in miracles in the sense that God can do miracles, but not that man does miracles. And the response that I usually get, and I hear that, I go, I agree. And the main premise why they're saying that is because of how people misuse the terminology miracles in our modern concept, in our modern times. They often, if you look at faith healers or things of that things of that nature, there's such a misuse of the premise of miracles. They're always inward concepts. It's always they had cancer, or there's a brain tumor, or there's something like that, or they couldn't walk and they're in a wheelchair. And they go through all this whole premise, and you see all of this, and it's exactly the opposite of what you actually see in the first century, what you see happening with the individuals who had the ability to lay hands on and to raise up, and miracles, the healing of people with withered hands, and people that had been not in a wheelchair for a long time, but literally bedridden to where their legs had no muscles on them. They were atrophied away, and then suddenly they were running and jumping through the streets. People healed of outward ailments like leprosy, where fingers and toes and so forth had fallen off. That it's a very different practice than what we see today. But I do always try to give a caveat to this, and I say, so when you go to the hospital to pray for someone who is sick, and you say, Father, heal them, do you expect a miracle, or are you just saying, God, use modern medicine however well you will? And so I want to balance what I believe God can do and make sure I'm not putting some type of blinders on myself as to what God can actually do. Now, it doesn't mean that I believe that God works at times in the same ways in which he seemingly did once, especially in the first century, with the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the way that we see pertaining in the first century. But I also do believe that God can still do miracles. I believe that God heals. I believe that God does what he says he can do, and that when he calls us to pray to him and call out to him, that he listens and he hears our voices. And with that in mind, I don't want us to ever fall into this habit of thinking that prayers are we're just going through the motions. And so that's the balance of this all. That's the balance of how we don't fall into just crude prayers where we just say the things, not expecting God to actually do anything with it, that God might not actually take what we've said and do it. And so I try to not be surprised when people come to me and say, hey, do you remember praying for this person? Man, it was just a miraculous thing, because the doctors gave him very little chance of survival, and now he's here and he's healed and so forth. And just at the same time being stopped and going, okay, well, maybe God did fantastic, wonderful things outside of what normally would have been done by medicine in that moment. I don't know, but I do know that God can. And I do believe that God does. Otherwise, what are we praying for? We're making friends with the walls if we're not praying when we pray for healing, or we pray for someone's soul, when we pray for individuals who walked away from the faith. When we pray for those things, are we just expecting nothing to happen? Are we just sending out wishes into the air? And that's a balance we have to make sure we keep. If the thing he prays for doesn't happen, then that is one more proof that petitionary prayer doesn't work. So this is the premise going back to heads I win, tails you lose, okay? If it does happen, he will of course be able to see some of the physical causes which led up to it, and therefore it would have happened anyway, and thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that prayers are ineffective. So this is how they play off of this premise. And I'll give you an example that I heard a few years ago. In fact, there was a young child. I forget where I was. I may have been in Texas, or I may have been in Birmingham. I can't remember. Where they had a young boy that had they thought he had leukemia, and I remember thinking, "Oh man, it's terrible." I think it was at Children's in Birmingham, and said, "This young boy has leukemia. Would you mind coming by the hospital and praying for him?" They had no ties to the church, but they were just. I think it was a member of the church had called us and said they are friends of the family, and so. At the time, I was a youth minister in the area, and so I went and visited the hospital and went in there and prayed for them, prayed for healing, prayed for those things. And I remember then going back to the church building and the rest, not knowing if I'd ever see them again in any way, shape, or form. And it was about 2 weeks later when they called me and said, believe it or not, someone had misread his files or had switched the files with another child, and so he actually doesn't have leukemia. There was no leukemia at all. In fact, he's doing great. And I remember sitting there kind of being upset at the whole premise, like, wow, I mean, how angry would I have been at that hospital who misread the diagnosis on that poor child, and the parents, and all the stuff that happened. And at the same time, I had to stop myself and thinking, or what if God did something? Or what if the child was healed? Or what if that misreading of the diagnosis was somehow a change of things? And I don't know. In fact, it would seem, from what I remember hearing at the time, that they had that there was somebody that was misreading the diagnosis of cancer in some of the children there, and so the children that were being diagnosed did not actually have cancer, and so there was like 2 or 3 children that were suddenly healed in essence. And so in some ways this is kind of what he's playing off of, is that therefore it would have happened anyway. So obviously he would have been fine either way, whether I went and prayed there or not for him. And so it's easy to see those things, or to often miss the fact, well, maybe it was there before and it wasn't misread, it's just not there anymore. You see, when we limit what God can and cannot do, it's easy for us to feel. And I wanted to use that as a real example for you, because I know how some of you may feel. It might go, oh, I don't know. I don't know about that. Well, that moment of I don't know is the point. Do you believe that God can heal? If that is the case, then absolutely it could have happened that way. I don't have to know the totality of it to know that it did happen. I do not have to know the totality of everything to know that God could have done those things. That's the premise. I don't know. But I believe that God can. And so with that in mind, that's kind of what he's hinting at here. You being a spirit, which will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion. But you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as future. Or even if he believes that the enemy does not see things that way, yet in his heart of hearts, he regards this as a peculiarity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though would say he did, that things as the enemy sees them are as things as they are. If you tried to explain to him that men's prayers today are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply that then the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely, but were predestined to do so. Boy, this is a whole other mess of theology when you stop and think about what he's getting at here. But the very premise of that if God already knew and thus everything is predestined, so even our prayers aren't really changing him. I believe Scripture would argue with that, especially if you look at how often we see, and they made petition to God, and then God listened to them or heard their voices or heard their cries, and thus altered, in essence, what was happening in that moment. That God can and has and always has works in the mess. He works in the mess that we create and through the messes, and while he being ever present, because he is a perpetual eternal, does not mean he lives in the past or the future. He is always present no matter where it is. And so, with that in mind, just because he is ever present does not mean that time does not exist in the way that we look at it, or that our choices are automatically predestined. What has been predestined is the outcome of those who choose God and those who do not. The consequences of not obeying God or falling away from God have been predestined, but the rest is a choice that each man or woman makes in their lives. And he would add that the weather on a given day can be traced back through its causes to the original creation of matter itself, so that the whole thing, both of the human and on the material side, is given from the word go. What he ought to say, of course, is obvious to us, that the problem of adapting the particular weather to particular prayers is merely the appearance at 2 points in his temporal mode of perception of the total problem of adapting the whole spiritual universe to the whole corporeal universe. That creation in its entirety operates at every point of space and time, or rather that their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole self-consistent creative act as a series of successive events. And so here he's saying, we just don't see it. We just don't see the totality of what it is. In fact, I heard recently, and this was one of my favorite notions, that when God said, "Let there be light," that even at this moment, that light is still expanding. From that word that was said, that was spoken in the beginning, that light is still ever expanding in this moment, continuously from that very creative mode. It's a fascinating concept. Why that creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems, the secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love. How it does so is no problem at all, for the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so in his unbounded now, his forever presence. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. That's a key component. To watch a man do something is not to make him do it. It would be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Boethius, have let their secret out. But in the intellectual climate which we have at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. Only the learned read old books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. Now, this one stings a little bit as an intellectual, as somebody who reads a lot, and as somebody who enjoys books and enjoys history. But I also understand what he's saying. In fact, there is a pervasive notion within academia, within the higher echelons of learning and the rest. There is a selfishness at times, a narcissism. There is a elitist mentality that comes about with it. And when they read, they don't read to learn. They read to say they have, or to simply be able to write something more, or to create something new, or to always look for that. And they don't read history to learn. They read to contradict, or to find something else about it, or to find a new interpretation or something of that notion, but they're not looking to acquire wisdom by doing so. We have done this by incalculating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in any ancient author, the one question he never asked is whether it is true, and this is what I was hinting at. He asks who influenced that ancient writer, and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase is the writer's development, or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. And boy, if that's not kind of an indictment on our academic world right now, I don't know what else would be. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as utterly simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others. Notice this, to cut them off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father in the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So let me just put this to you. Here you are, sitting along with me on this Thursday night, or wherever you may be watching at a different time, listening to a book written almost 70 years ago, 80 years ago. And you're doing so with a hope, and it's my hope, that you're seeking its wisdom, seeking to learn from it and the rest. And that's not always the case, but that's my hope. And with that in mind, you are doing something different than what a lot of other people do. And I hope you're looking for this, and that's part of why we're doing this study, is to glean what we can, that we might learn from it, that we might gain its wisdom. We're not reading to say we've read Screwtape Letters. We're not reading to say I've read C.S. Lewis and the rest, and I disagree with him on this, and I agree with him on that. But instead, we're trying to find what might we glean that might be true, that can help us in our understanding of our life. So, letter 28, let's dive in. My dear Wormwood, when I told you not to fill your letters with rubbish about the war, I meant, of course, that I did not want to have your rather infantile rhapsodies about the death of men and the destruction of cities. Insofar as the war really concerns the spiritual state of the patient, I naturally want full reports, and on this aspect you seem singularly obtuse. Thus you tell me with glee that there is reason to expect heavy air raids on the town where the creature lives. This is a crying example of something I have complained about already, your readiness to forget the main point in your immediate enjoyment of human suffering. Do you not know that bombs kill men? Now, this is a fascinating notion, right? This whole letter is interesting. Or do you not realize that the patient's death at this moment is precisely what we want to avoid? He has escaped the worldly friends with whom you tried to entangle him. He has fallen in love with a very Christian woman and is temporarily immune from your attacks on his chastity. And the various methods of corrupting his spiritual life which we have been trying are so far unsuccessful. At the present moment, as the full impact of the war draws nearer and his worldly hopes take a proportionally lower place in his mind, full of his defense work, full of the girl, forced to attend to his neighbors more than he has ever done before, and liking it more than he expected, taken out of himself, as the humans say, and daily increasing in conscious dependence on the enemy, he will almost certainly be lost to us if he is killed tonight. So notice these demons are actually arguing with the premise of this war is not a good thing for us. Because if he were to die tonight, he would die in a saved state. He would be lost to us. So why do you keep celebrating just their pain and suffering when you actually might lose your patient? This is so obvious that I am ashamed to write it. I sometimes wonder if your young fiends are not kept out on temptation duty too long at a time, if you are not in some danger of becoming infected by the sentiments and values of the humans among whom you work. They, of course, do tend to regard death as the prime evil, and survival as the greatest good. But that is because we have taught them to do so. Oh, this is a fascinating notion. A fascinating notion about that death is the ultimate worst thing that could happen to a person, and survival is the greatest good. Now, I would argue if you die in the Lord, it's the greatest good of all. But if you die outside of the Lord, it's one of the greatest worst things that could happen. But what could also happen is if you live your whole entire life in the Lord, but then right before you die, you turn your back on God, all those years of living in the Lord would have done nothing if you turn your back on God in the end. So living a long life in that sense is not ultimately the best thing. And so this life or death premise that he's playing about is a fascinating notion. Do not let us be infected by our own propaganda. I know it seems strange that your chief aim at the moment should be the very same thing for which the patient's lover and his mother are praying, namely his bodily safety. But so it is. You should be guarding him like the apple of your eye. If he dies now, you lose him. If he survives the war, there is always hope. The enemy has guarded him from you through the first great wave of temptations. But if only he can be kept alive, you have time itself for your ally. The long, dull, monotonous years of middle-aged prosperity or middle-aged adversity are excellent campaigning weather. You see, it is so hard for these creatures to persevere. Oh boy, that's an indictment on human characters at times, isn't it? That it is so hard for us to persevere. But notice he's hinting at that the long, dull, monotonous years of middle-aged prosperity or middle-aged adversity, the day in and day out grind of going to a job and going and doing the things, that's where he's saying we can wear them out. That's good campaigning weather. That's where you can, in the old days of going door knocking, that's good door knocking weather. It's going out there and doing that is when they're just going through the motions consistently. The routine of adversity, the gradual decay of youthful loves and youthful hopes, the quiet despair, hardly felt as pain, of ever overcoming the chronic temptations with which we have again and again defeated them, the drabness which we create in their lives, and the inarticulate resentment with which we teach them to respond to it. All this provides admirable opportunities of wearing out a soul by attrition, over and over and over and over again. If, on the other hand, the middle years prove prosperous, our position is even stronger. Prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. His increasing reputation, his widening circle of acquaintances, his sense of importance, the growing pressure of absorbing and agreeable work, build up in him a sense of being really at home at earth, which is just what we want. You will notice that the young are generally less unwilling to die than the middle-aged and the old. The truth is that the enemy, having oddly destined these mere animals to life in his own eternal world, has guarded them pretty effectively from the danger of feeling at home anywhere else. That is why we must often wish long life to our patients. 70 years is not a day too much for the difficult task of unraveling their souls from heaven and building up a firm attachment to the earth. Oh man, this is some rich material right here. This very premise of making the earth feel like our home as opposed to where we're being called home to, which is to heaven. And you know the verses, you know the songs. This world is not my home, I'm just passing through, for our citizenship is in heaven. And over again, this reminder is tough when, we have our own homes. And here I am sitting in a new home tonight, this week. And it's different, but it feels like a new thing. And I have to remind myself over and over again that this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. And that reminder is hard at times because I'm still here right now. And even though I'm here, which means that God has a purpose for me and God has a design for me and a desire for me and what I'm doing, doesn't make it any easier at times to not just get caught up in that and find that all my lifely duties are here in this moment. While they are young, we find them always shooting off at a tangent. Even if we contrive to keep them ignorant of explicit religion, the incalculable winds of fantasy and music and poetry, the mere face of a girl, the song of a bird, or the sight of a horizon are always blowing our whole structure away. They will not apply themselves steadily to worldly advancement, prudent connections, and the policy of safety first. So inveterate is their appetite for heaven that our best method at this stage of attaching them to earth is to make them believe that earth can be turned into heaven at some future date by politics or eugenics or science or psychology or whatnot. Real worldliness is a work of time, assisted, of course, by pride, for we teach them to describe the creeping death as good sense or maturity or experience. So I would say that there is a lot of our churches are dealing with this right now, are dealing with the very premise of getting attached to the earthly things and trying to fix all the earthly problems and turning the world into heaven. I mean, you look at a lot of, even through my studies through Marxism and communism, it's very much in the premise of creating a utopia, a perfect world, a perfect situation for humanity where all are equal and all are treated equal and the rest. And I do believe that in the idea is fantastic. And I'm not talking about communism itself. I'm talking about the idea of that all men are created equal and that all should be treated fairly and that all should be loved and seen in those ways. What I'm talking about is the how we do that at times is through human terms, and human terms often are faulty and frail, and they falter and they fail all the time. And so trying to solve worldly problems or eternal problems with worldly solutions only leads to more problems. Trying to bring heaven on earth in some premises or create heaven on earth, I don't believe is something that can be done from a standpoint of outside of the spiritual, that through the church, through faith, through those things is where we can find peace in this world, where we can find hope in this world. There's but one way to the Father, and that is through Jesus the Son. And so at times trying to fix all the world's problems through this politician or that politician or science or psychology or politics or whatever it may be, if we just had, if we were just a little bit more mature, if we were just had more experience than the rest, we falter ourselves into these false sense of security, into these empty wells, as I often call them. Experience, in the particular sense we teach them to give it, is, by the by, a most useful word. A great human philosopher nearly let our secret out when he said that where virtue is concerned, experience is the mother of illusion. But thanks to a change in fashion and also, of course, to the historical point of view, we have largely rendered his book innocuous. Now, I should note, just think of how often this is played out in our world today. So substitute the word experience for experts. Experts say. Boy, isn't that kind of telling right now in our world? Experts say, and this is the illusion that's being given of experience, or experts are the mother of illusion. How valuable time it is to us may be gauged by the fact that the enemy allows us so little of it. The majority of the human race dies in infancy. Of the survivors, a good many die in youth. It is obvious that to him, human birth is important chiefly as the qualification for human death, and death solely as the gate to that other kind of life. We are allowed to work only on a selected minority of the race, for what humans call a normal life is the exception. Boy, this is telling. In fact, most of us don't realize that the lifespans of human beings have extended so much in the last 100 years through modern medicine, a lot of things, that living beyond 60, 65 is, was uncommon for most of history. And now it's almost the norm. I think in the U.S., the average age, I think, is 72, and maybe 70 for men and 72 for women. But for most of history, it was significantly less than that. And in the ancient world, infant mortality was at huge rates. I would argue our infant mortality is actually higher now than it ever has been due to abortion alone. But those are the cases that you'd find. And so I think what he's saying here is still spot on in a lot of ways. Apparently, he wants some, but only a very few, of the human animals with which he is peopling heaven to have had the experiences of resisting us through an earthly life of 60 or 70 years. Well, there is our opportunity. The smaller it is, the better we must use it. Whatever you do, keep your patient as safe as you possibly can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So this is a fascinating notion that demons might look at our time on this earth, 60 to 70 years, as a very small window in which to gain a soul. And I would argue that's probably true in light of eternity, that this is a very small window of time. So, letter 29, are you ready? Here we go. My dear Wormwood, now that it is certain the German humans will bombard your patient's town and that his duties will keep him in the thick of the danger, we must consider our policy. Are we to aim at cowardice, or at courage with consequent pride, or at hatred of the Germans? Well, I'm afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success it is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. So courage here, in his mind, is seen as a virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage, or Shylock without self-denial as regards the flesh? But as we cannot supply these qualities ourselves, we can only use them as supplied by the enemy, and this means leaving him a kind of foothold in those men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory arrangement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better. Hatred we can manage. The tension of human nerves during noise, danger, and fatigue makes them prone to any violent emotion, and it is only a question of guiding the susceptibility into the right channels. If conscience resists, muddle him. Let him say that he feels hatred not of his own behalf, but on that of the women and children, and that a Christian is told to forgive his own, not other people's enemies. So here he's playing off of, let's see if we can get him to hate the Germans. Let's see if we can get him to hate others, as opposed to merely see them as someone who he disagrees with or he has problems with. Make sure you create an enemy out of them. And it's not that he hates them, he just hates what he's doing to others. And so that's the problem. In other words, let him consider himself sufficiently identified with the women and children to feel hatred on their behalf, but not sufficiently identified to regard their enemies as his own, and therefore proper objects of forgiveness. This is a key component. And you have to remember what this must have felt like during the war, and especially when you talk about Germans and the rest in World War II. Oh man, this has been heavy. But hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice, alone of all the vices, is purely painful. Horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And hatred is also a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in his charity, you should therefore first defeat his courage. Defeat his courage. Oh, to use hatred. And when I look at our political system in this world today, how everyone we are called to hate or disdain or look down upon, or to speak of, whether it's President Trump or President Biden and the rest, with just such disdain and the miseries. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And so we create fear of what all will happen. And there's terminologies like, we have to save our democracy, and the premise is if we're all going to die if something goes wrong, or if one of these men is voted in. And it's just this ludicrous notion of otherisms where we create and instill fear, which creates and gives foothold to hatred. Now, this is ticklish business. We have made men proud of most vices, but not of cowardice. Whenever we have almost succeeded in doing so, the enemy permits a war or an earthquake or some other calamity, and at once courage becomes so obviously lovely and important, even in human eyes, that all of our work is undone. And there is still at least one vice in which they feel genuine shame, which is cowardice. Um, I'll tell you this is true. I found this to be true, at least, is that we see this when it comes to whenever there's a terrible tragedy. You can always tell the heroes. You can always tell the people are the ones who are running towards it, not away from it. The ones who are looking to save, the first responders, our police forces, and the rest. And this is, I'll tell you, I feel this fairly strongly in our culture today, that there is a very strong push against those who naturally do the toughest jobs that are out there when it comes to dealing with the hardest situations, the evils of our world, whether it's the military, whether it's the police, and the rest. And we associate the worst actions of some in those categories and apply it broadly. And we see a whole demographic within our culture and a political movement within our culture and the rest that seeks to create disdain or look down upon those groups that actively look to protect and to serve and the rest on a consistent basis. And the way that they create this is they create a fear of these individuals. And I want to also acknowledge in some ways there have been situations and there will be situations where human beings fail at doing the jobs that they have been called to do, that there will be death and despair, that there will be abuse, there will be mistreatment, and that is where God alone can step in and help heal and change those situations. But most often, if you can also take the very premise of courage, the very premise of service, the very premise, and then create a disdain or a fear of those things, then the devil has won in a lot of ways. And that is a particular way I believe it's actually working itself out in our culture right now. The danger of inducing cowardice in our patients, therefore, is lest we produce real self-knowledge and self-loathing, with consequent repentance and humility. So cowardice doesn't always help when you can see them ultimately repent. And in fact, in the last war, thousands of humans, by discovering their own cowardice, discovered the whole moral world for the first time. In peace, we can make many of them ignore good and evil entirely. In danger, the issue is forced upon them in a guise to which even we cannot blind them. There is here a cruel dilemma before us. If we promoted justice and charity among men, we should be playing directly into the enemy's hands. But if we guide them to the opposite behavior, this sooner or later produces, for he permits it to produce, a war or a revolution, and the undisguisable issue of cowardice or courage awakes thousands of men from moral stupor. I don't believe we're on the brink of war as it pertains to the United States. I don't believe in the nonsense that everybody's shouting out about civil war and all the rest. I do believe we are in weak times, and weak times produce weak men, produce weak people, broadly speaking. But then those tough times that come from weak men often produce tough people. And I believe that there's a circular pattern to that, and we are on the lower end of that. And it is my role as a husband, as a father, as a minister, and the rest to help raise up strong children, to deal with a weak world, to deal with a broken world in the way, and to teach courage in the face of adversity and courage in the face of problems and the issues of this life. This, indeed, is probably one of the enemy's motives for creating a dangerous world, a world in which moral issues really come to the point. He sees as well as you do that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form at which every virtue at its testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. Chastity or honesty or mercy which yields to danger will be chaste or honest or merciful only on conditions. Pilate was merciful till it became risky. I love that little note. Pilate was merciful until it became risky. It is therefore possible to lose as much as we gain by making your man a coward. He may learn too much about himself. There is, of course, always the chance, not of chloroforming the shame, but of aggravating it and producing despair. This would be a great triumph. This is why I hope you see from me, as even I speak about our politics and the things that are going on now, I don't despair about life and about the things around us. I believe God is in control, and the good times are the bad. This too shall pass if it's bad times, and this too shall pass if it's good times. Ultimately, it's about being in with the Lord and with God. It would show that he had believed in and accepted the enemy's forgiveness of his other sins only because he himself did not fully feel their sinfulness. That in respect of the one vice which he really understands, in its full depth of dishonor he cannot seek nor credit the mercy. But I fear you have already let him go too far in the enemy's school, and he knows that despair is a greater sin than any of the sins which provoke it. As to the actual technique of temptations to cowardice, not much need be said. The main point is that precautions have a tendency to increase fear. The precautions publicly enjoined on your patient, however, soon become a matter of routine, and this effect disappears. What you must do is to keep running in his mind, side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty, the vague idea of all sorts of things he can do or not do inside the framework of the duty which seem to make him a little safer. Get his mind off the simple rule, I've got to stay here and do so and so, into a series of imaginary lifelines. If A happened, though I very much hope it won't, I could do B, and if the worst came to the worst, I could always do C. Superstitions, if not recognized as such, can be awakened. Basically, this goes back to one of my favorite sayings, which is worry is a terrible misuse of imagination. And so this is the premise he's getting at. Create anxieties in him, create worries in him, create where he's creating all these scenarios in head. If A happened, and though I wouldn't want that to happen, but then I could do B. But if B happened, then I would do C, and have him living constantly in imagination. The point is to keep him feeling that he has something other than the enemy and courage the enemy supplies to fall back on. Well, I've got plan A, plan B, plan C, and the rest. Instead of just going, God is in control, I can trust on him. So that what was intended to be a total commitment to duty becomes honeycombed all through with little unconscious reservations. By building up a series of imaginary expedients to prevent the worst coming to worst, you may produce, at that level of his will which he is not aware of, a determination that the worst shall not come to the worst. Then, at the moment of real terror, rush it out into his nerves and muscles, and you may get the fatal act done before he knows what you're about. For remember, the act of cowardice is all that matters. The emotion of fear is, in and of itself, no sin, and though we enjoy it, does us no good. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Basically, overcome him with emotion, overcome him with all the anxieties and the rest, so that when the actual moment of courage or cowardice comes, make sure it's cowardice and not courage. So that's where he sets forth. So that is the letters for this evening. Next week, 30 and 31, and then we'll wrap up the following week. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. So grateful for you and for your presence each and every week. I love you all. If I can serve you in any way, shape, or form, please reach out to me. I'm always here for you if I can be, even if we're in completely different cities. Love you all. Can't wait to see you next week. I hope to see you very soon. If I don't see you in person, I'll see you online next Thursday night. Have a great one. Bye-bye.